So last week I did a benchmark on the 8600G just to see how it's going to perform when it comes to modern titles. Today we are going to be benchmarking the 8600G when it comes to productivity. I mean, it's not here, I'm not holding it. This is not even an 8600G box, but actually a Ryzen 7000 box. The 8600G is in this beautiful system, which by the way has 32 gigs of DDR5, 5200 MHz RAM, and of course I don't have a discrete GPU because we are testing the 8600G as it is. So what softwares can you expect in today's video? Of course, the typical productivity software like Photoshop, Adobe Illustrator, Autodesk Maya, Blender, DaVinci Resolve. You can expect all of these softwares in today's video. And spoiler alert, the 8600G was actually able to keep up with this software. So let's jump in and see how the 8600G APU from AMD performs. So as is standard with most benchmarking videos, you have to make sure that you are running the latest and greatest drivers for whatever CPU and GPU you're using. So for me, I have the latest AMD drivers set. And the first area of productivity that I looked at using the 8600G was graphic design. I started my graphic design productivity test with Photoshop by just opening a typical Photoshop project, doing whatever you need to do in Photoshop. You know, if you've used Photoshop, you already know what you do in Photoshop. And what I have to say about the 8600G is that the processor was able to handle everything that I threw at it. Photoshop was pretty much smooth, but I do have to note with Adobe apps that your RAM speed and RAM capacity really matters. And so I have no problem saying that the 32 gigs of DDR5 memory in my system was playing a hand in making things feel smooth. Overall, I think if you're only doing Photoshop and that's the only thing you do on a regular basis, then I would say the 8600G is more than enough and more than capable in this software. The next software that I tested for graphic design, or rather for productivity that is related to graphic design, is Adobe Illustrator. Now, in case you don't know what Adobe Illustrator is a vector-based image manipulation tool. Illustrator was smooth for the most part, though I did notice a bit of lag, especially when zooming into complex vector files, so I don't know what's up with that. Additionally, when I went to the software's preferences, I did note that the GPU option for animated zooms and scaling was turned off. For some reason, Adobe Illustrator does not detect the integrated GPU that the 8600G comes with. Other than that, for the most part, navigating and just working in Illustrator using the 8600G was a breeze. No noticeable issues other than those stated, and I will say that the 8600G in Adobe Illustrator is more than capable. Okay, so now we're moving into another area of productivity, and the area that we are going to be tackling is video editing. So the first software that I benchmarked when it comes to video editing is DaVinci Resolve. So I will note that last time, if you watched the AMD versus Nvidia for video editing, you did remember that DaVinci Resolve was crashing a lot. Now, I did actually find the issue. The issue was actually River Tuner statistics. I had to disable it for DaVinci Resolve to stop crashing. So the AMD side of things is actually pretty usable when it comes to DaVinci Resolve. So how did the 8600G perform in DaVinci Resolve? I was actually quite surprised that my timeline was smooth, no issues, no stuttering even when playing back footage. Editing for the most part was pretty much a breeze with no noticeable lags. Of course, I had to turn down my resolution at times. This is because the integrated GPU in the 8600G pretty much lacks any kind of memory. So I did find that most of the video playback was offloaded to the RAM. And because of this reason, things like color grading were a bit challenging for the 8600G to keep up with. To be fair though, DaVinci Resolve's color grading can be a bit heavy and actually leans on Nvidia cards a lot. So that is something you always have to keep in mind, that DaVinci Resolve is very biased to Nvidia cards. When it actually came to rendering out a video, I will say that I found something interesting happening. Now, because the 8600G is a modern CPU, the integrated GPU that it comes with has support for modern codecs like AV1, which was something I actually found out when it came to video rendering. So if I wanted to render out a video in AV1, I had to use the AMF encoder that AMD graphics cards use. So if I wanted to render out a video in AV1, I pretty much could do it using the AMD AMF encoder. So when choosing the option to render using the native encoder, which actually uses the CPU, I found that the renders went a bit faster. And of course, this is because this is a 6-core 12-thread CPU, so those extra threads and extra cores make quick work of video rendering. So switching to Premiere Pro, the story is no different. My timeline was a bit smoother than it was in DaVinci Resolve, and for the most part, editing, cutting, light color grading here and there felt pretty much smooth. Of course, I did try to use the same timeline that I was using in Resolve, and I exported the color grade that I did in DaVinci Resolve as a LUT and applied it to Premiere Pro just to make sure that things were a little bit matching. And for the most part in Premiere Pro, I actually did not encounter any hiccups when it came to the overall editing process. So I will say that the 8600G fared pretty well in Premiere Pro. When it came to rendering a video, the same thing that I found out in DaVinci Resolve, where using the CPU is faster, also applies here. And of course, if you're interested in rendering with the CPU only, you need to set your encoder to Mercury Playback software. This will ensure that Premiere Pro renders the video using the CPU, which often or not seems to be a bit faster. So the next area of productivity that we are going to be investigating using the 8600G is motion graphics. Specifically, the tool that we are going to be using is Adobe After Effects. Now, I will note again that After Effects, specifically After Effects, is very heavy on RAM usage. So for the most part, using the 8600G was a breeze, and opening up compositions and just messing around in the compositions was pretty much smooth. But I will say most of the heavy lifting was done by the 32 gigs of DDR5 RAM. Okay, so the next area of productivity that we are going to be testing is in 3D rendering, or just 3D related productivity. And the first software on this list is Autodesk Maya. For the most part, navigating around the interface was pretty smooth, no hiccups, modeling stuff, moving stuff around. Even the mesh density didn't seem to affect the 8600G. Now remember that in the last video, I did note that even though Maya's native renderer Arnold does not support AMD GPUs, it does support using the GPU in the viewport. So I can say that the integrated GPU was definitely being used in making the viewport smooth. And so when it comes to 3D rendering, we obviously do not expect any miracles, as we know Maya's native renderer, as I have already pointed out, favors NVIDIA cards, and because of this reason I was stuck to rendering using my CPU. And for the most part, using my past experience using a 4-core CPU in Autodesk Maya, I will say that the 6-core 12-thread 8600G handled the CPU rendering quite nicely. Of course, it wasn't as blazing fast, and images actually took a while to resolve. I will say that the 8600G was doing a good job. In as much as I recommend the 8600G when it comes to Maya, in my own opinion, I will say for anything 3D, you actually need to buy a dedicated discrete graphics card. So moving on to the next software, which is Blender. Blender, as you know, is quite a popular free 3D animation software, and because Blender has support for the AMD HIP SDK, I did find that the integrated GPU was detected by Blender's rendering engine, which is Cycles. For the most part, navigating in the viewport was smooth, no hiccups, though I will note that for the first time I loaded up the scene and switched to the textured view, it actually did take quite a while to compute the scene. But once it was done and everything was displayed correctly, I would say that Blender pretty much became responsive. So as I had noted earlier, because this AMD CPU has an integrated GPU and Blender actually supports HIP rendering, I actually had the option to render using the integrated GPU. My only issue with rendering with the integrated GPU was that I kept getting an out of memory error, which pretty much forced me to use the CPU.